Here at North Carolina State's College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, we're working hard to identify and solve the grand challenges faced by North Carolinians, our nation, and our world. Our stakeholders are diverse. They include farmers, scientists, business leaders, legislators, environmentalists, veterinarians, educators, innovators, investors, communities, and families. Every day we work in close partnership with these stakeholders, from global ag biotech companies to backyard. One challenge that has been identified over and over from every sector and every scale of operation is the management of a safe and reliable water supply. In the past year alone, we've seen the dramatic extremes of water availability unfold here in the United States, a severe and persistent drought in California, and deadly flooding most recently in South Carolina. Beyond the supply of water, there is also the matter of water quality. In much the same way that you are what you eat, we can also say that you are what you drink. Today we have come together to hear a variety of perspectives on water in our growing world, to identify the key challenges that we will be facing today and, more importantly, in the future, and to talk about how to move forward and ensure a safe and plentiful water supply for future generations. It is my pleasure to introduce our Master of Ceremonies, Dr. Wayne Skaggs. Dr. Skaggs is one of the nation's foremost experts in water engineering. The large majority of his 45-year tenure at North Carolina State University has been devoted to teaching and conducting research in drainage and subsurface water management. His work includes the development of the water management model, DrainMod, which is widely used by consulting engineers, researchers, and governmental agencies. In recognition of his many contributions, Dr. Skaggs has received dozens of awards, including induction into the National Academy of Engineers. Please join me in welcoming and honoring Dr. Wayne Skaggs.
Thank you, Dean, and welcome to the 2015 Stewards of the Future Conference on Water for a Growing World. I have spent my career in teaching and research, as the Dean has just noted, in the area of agricultural water management, and I'm admittedly biased about the importance of water. But if you doubt its importance, then I would suggest that you simply Google 3 words, world water scarcity, and look at the expected evolution of massive water shortages around the world and the stresses they will cause. The scale of the problem is enormous. It is enormous from the perspective of basic needs for drinking water, for water resources necessary for food production for a growing world population, and for water quality in our streams and estuaries. It is not an exaggeration to say that governments will fall and wars will be fought because of the stresses caused by the scarcity of water. While the problems are enormous, so is the scale of our opportunities to make positive contributions to what I believe is the most important of the grand challenges facing us for the next 2 or 3 generations. The challenges are immense, but I am optimistic that we are capable of finding solutions. I'm optimistic because I've seen the progress we have made, both at the university and in industry, in finding ways to conserve water and improve water quality. I'm optimistic because I've seen what our students have done, both in industry and here at the university, as they have developed and applied new technologies here, and as some have returned to countries like Egypt and Indonesia and China and others to enhance and develop new methods, to apply the methods they've learned here and to enhance and develop new methods appropriate for specific water-related issues there. We're fortunate today to have the opportunity to discuss the nature of the challenges, recent progress on a range of important issues, and approaches for continued future progress. I'm excited about today's program and want to get started right away with the introduction of our keynote speaker, Mr. Brian Richter. It is my pleasure to introduce Brian, who has been a global leader in river science and conservation for more than 25 years. He's Director of Global Freshwater Strategies for the Nature Conservancy, where he has consulted on more than 120 projects worldwide. He serves as a water advisor to some of the world's largest corporations, investment banks, and the United Nations, and he has testified before the U.S. Congress on multiple occasions. He also teaches a course on water sustainability at the University of Virginia. Mr. Richter has published many scientific papers on the importance of ecologically sustained water management in international journals, and has co-authored a book with Sandra Postal entitled Rivers for Life, Managing Water for People and Nature. His new book, Chasing Water, A Guide for Moving from Scarcity to Sustainability, was published by Island Press in June 2014. Please join me in welcoming Brian Richter.
Wayne, thank you very much for that kind and flattering introduction that I wrote. I want to start by thanking all of you in the room. You really are stewards of the future, and your work is so critically important. As Wayne just said, and I couldn't agree with him more, water is the most important resource issue for humanity in the 21st century. And there are lots of reasons to be concerned about it. It's going to need all of our attention. It's going to need all of our best thinking, all of our creativity, all of our innovation. But I'm also remain quite hopeful. I'm quite optimistic, and hopefully I can convey some of both the concerns as well as some of the optimism in my presentation this morning. So as Wayne, in my introduction, he mentioned that I'd just written a book, and so I've spent most of my career working for an international conservation organization called the Nature Conservancy. I've been able to work at the global level for much of the last couple of decades, and I've seen a lot of places in the world that are really struggling with their water issues. And over the course of that time, I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. I've seen people that are still struggling mightily with their water challenges, some on the edge of life, literally. I will tell you some of those stories. I'll show you some of those pictures here in a moment. But I've also had the chance to see some very hopeful signs, some interesting reforms in water policy and law, in different ways of managing water. And so a couple of years ago, I had this opportunity to gather my thoughts, to hopefully share some of what I've learned along the way. But also for me, the process of writing a book was very helpful and stimulating, because there were a couple of questions that I still had and that I wanted to know more about. Things like, I'd seen a lot of places where water scarcity, water shortages were affecting people and natural ecosystems, but I wanted a more comprehensive, a more global perspective on that. So this effort, this work gave me a chance to do that. I wanted to know more about the why. I had my own opinions about why people were running out of water. I'd seen some bad examples of water being managed poorly, but I wanted to, again, understand the fuller story about that. And I wanted to know the fuller breadth of where this is happening. Where are people exactly running out of water in the world? And is it only in the very driest parts of the world, or is it in some of the wettest as well? And of course, most importantly, isn't there some way to avoid this? Isn't there some way to avoid getting into trouble? Or once you're in trouble, how are people trying to find their way out? How are they trying to move to a more sustainable level of water management? And so one of the things I've become involved with over the last 5-10 years is working with a number of different global water modeling teams. These are typically in academic settings, research institutes, where scientists and literally hundreds of graduate students, postdocs, are working on trying to improve the quality, the accuracy of these global water models. This particular map is showing the results of just one of those. This comes out of the University of Kassel in Germany. This water model is called Water Gap. And basically what this model is trying to do for 150,000 individual water basins around the world, individual river basins, individual lake basins, individual aquifers, trying to simulate the inputs and outputs out of those water basins. So a basic water budget calculation for all these different places. And so how much water is available? How much is renewable on an average annual or a episodic basis? How much of that water is being removed from those systems, from those water systems, and put to use in the human enterprise? How much water is left? How is the water being used? And so these are some of the kinds of questions that we can ask now of these global models. And again, they're getting more and more accurate, more and more detailed, it seems like, with every year. I want to be quick to point out, as somebody who has spent a career working for the conservation of freshwater ecosystems, I see a lot of actually good in this map. 2/3 of this map is in a gray color, meaning it's not in a hot zone, which means in the interpretation of this map, that means that the available renewable water resources are still being used fairly lightly. In fact, in most of that grayish blue area, we are consumptively using something on the order of maybe 5 to 20% of the annual renewable water supplies. What that means is that the freshwater ecosystems in most of those places, and the freshwater plants and animals dependent upon those ecosystems, are probably in pretty good shape. Now, a lot of them are experiencing pollution problems. This is really a story and a map of water quantity, not so much about water quality. And so a lot of these places are having difficulties with excessive water pollution, but at least there's some potential that most of the water is still there. Now, the other third, of course, is a very different story. In the other third, what's represented on this map are places that, at least periodically, if not all of the time on a constant basis, the available renewable water resources are being very heavily depleted, very heavily exhausted, beyond 75%. And it's, in fact, in many of these places, more than 100%. Because, as we all know, for example, there are many groundwater aquifers around the world which are declining steadily, and in some cases very rapidly, and so they're using more than 100% of the naturally available recharge into those aquifers. Some of the frightening things about this picture is the disproportionate distribution of the human population and some of the things that we care about, like irrigated agriculture. So as you see in the stats there, half of the world's population is affected by water shortages, as depicted in these hot zones on the map. About half of the world's larger cities lie in those areas, and about 3/4 of all of the irrigated agriculture is taking place in these basins that are regularly bumping up against the limits of the available water supply. A couple of other things I want to say about this map is that, as with so many maps and so many calculations and so many statistics, it's based on averages, average annual conditions, or even average monthly conditions. And so things actually get worse at times. On the tails of the distribution, things can actually veer into worse conditions that are what are depicted here. The other thing at the bottom of the slide, you note that these are data based on 2005. We're very anxious to be able to update these maps based on 2010 or even 2015 data. So in many of these hotspots, things have become more challenging. More and more of the available water supplies are being utilized. If you zoom in a little bit and you go to just the United States, and this is a different model, results here, but very telling. If you look at the western half of the United States, you see an awful lot of red. And this is a very interesting statistic in my mind. In the western U.S., over half of all the streams and rivers are being depleted by more than 50%. And 1/4 of all the rivers and streams are being depleted by more than 75%. So what we see on the landscape, what we see in the stream channels of the western United States is a very, very different situation than we would have seen during my lifetime, earlier in my lifetime. And so of great concern, and having big effects on many different aspects of our lives and on the health of the freshwater ecosystems, again, that are dependent upon these places. This balance, this tenuous balance between inputs and outputs, or what I'll keep referring to as water budgets, becomes particularly acute in the case of groundwater aquifers. As you all know, groundwater aquifers are fairly slow to recharge, at least in most places in the world, unless you've got a highly conductive karst aquifer, limestone aquifers that recharge fairly rapidly. But even in those environments, we're finding ourselves getting ahead of the balance point In other words, we're consuming the water out of these aquifers faster than the water is making it back in, that is being recharged into these aquifers. So there's been some very important work done here in North Carolina, and I wanted to acknowledge that within the Central Coast aquifers, Central Coastal Plain aquifers, I should say, some real challenges with this imbalance between inputs and outputs and declining water levels and drops in these aquifer levels of tens to hundreds of feet in some places. And so again, these challenges exist, and what we've learned from our research is that it's not just the semi-arid and the arid places in the world, but there are places that get 50, 60 or more inches of rain, and the problem is just simply the challenge of the imbalance between the inputs and the outputs. So water shortages are afflicting people all around the world living in all climate zones. When you ask the question of why is this happening, when I ask the question of why this is happening, the answer is intuitive, I think, to all of you, but some of these graphs, I think, really help to make it crystal clear and help to simplify it, at least in my mind. So this is a graph of the trace of history for the Colorado River Basin out in the western United States. The blue line on the top is a 10-year running average. So it expresses the variability in the renewable water supplies. We know things aren't the same. They aren't always on average or never behaving as the mean. And this is even a smooth line. It's a 10-year running average. So, of course, there's more variation going on in that blue trace than what's actually depicted here. But the other line is the continual progressive increase in the water use. And this is consumptive use, meaning this is the water that's removed from the Colorado River Basin and not coming back as return flow, not coming back from wastewater treatment plants, not coming back as agricultural return flows. This is the water that's being consumptively lost. And so you see this progressive increase over time. And so the basic problem here is our inability to control or to regulate that increasing use. And it's not until we bump up against the limits of the water availability and we start to experience widespread shortages and start to experience them in a very deep and meaningful and painful way that we start to have conversations about maybe we should be a little bit more careful, or maybe we should put some controls on this use. Maybe we should be thinking about what the limits of the available water are, and what do we want to do with that water that's available? Are we using it to the optimal extent? So that's a trace of the Colorado River Basin. I've been fascinated with the similarities between the Colorado and the Murray-Darling Basin, which is in the southeastern lobe of the country of Australia. Very much the same story. Again, the lighter shaded blue on the top is the water availability. The darker blue on the bottom is the increasing water use over time. And very, very tragically for the Australians, right about the time that those two lines began to collide, they went into the worst drought that they had ever seen or heard of within their country. It was called the Millennium Drought, also referred to as the Big Dry. The available water supply dropped to less than a third of the average annual for about a 12-year period, from 1997 to about 2009, and caused terrible consequences in Australia. And so let me start to show you some of the face of water shortage. Here's some of the things that go wrong. This is the Colorado River Delta. So the Colorado River, for the most part, except in really rare and extraordinary years of great wetness and huge snowpacks in the Rocky Mountains, the Colorado River no longer runs the gauntlet of water users and makes it all the way to its delta and its mouth in the Gulf of California, the Sea of Cortez in Mexico. In fact, this is what the delta looks like. It's a huge, sun-baked, salt-caked wasteland, if you will. Now, interestingly, this is a place that at one time was one of the most important wetland ecosystems in all of North America. Covered more than 2 million acres. Incredibly important for the Pacific flyway of migratory birds, ducks, geese, other waterfowl that passed from south to north and in the reverse in their migrations back and forth. It's also a place that the great American conservationist Aldo Leopold wrote about when he visited the Delta in the early 1920s. And Aldo used the phrase, a milk and honey wilderness, which I don't know exactly what that means, but I think it meant that Aldo was pretty impressed. with what he saw there, the abundance of wildlife. His brother, he writes about how he and his brother, the number of ducks and geese that they hunted, the number of fish that they caught. One of the most fascinating facts about this place that just that's still hard for me to imagine is there used to be a fish called the totwaba that would grow to 6 feet in length and 100 pounds in weight that used to swim in the delta. And Aldo referred to these deep green pools, these lagoons that existed in the delta. And in my book, I refer to the fact that trying to think of a fish like the totwaba swimming in the delta now is like trying to imagine life on other planets. Here's the picture of, here's the face of water scarcity and shortage in Australia. The big fish that this fellow is carrying out of these creeks have dried up very severely. In fact, many of the tributaries in the smaller rivers in the Murray-Darling Basin literally dried up completely during the Millennium Drought. This is the Murray cod. It's one of the most beautiful and exciting freshwater animals on the planet. People come from all over the world to try to catch a Murray cod. It's an extremely exhilarating experience, I can tell you from personal experience. And they died by the thousands. Massive fish kill during the Millennium Drought. But also, tragically, there's a human face to this story. The agricultural economy of the Murray-Darling Basin, which is, by the way, providing 40% of all the food for Australians, tremendously important to the agricultural exports of that country, particularly into Asia. Aspects of the agricultural economy in the Murray-Darling Basin collapsed completely and probably will never come back. The rice industry went out of business. Dairy farmers, sheep farmers saw entire herds dying on the hoof. Devastating to Australian farming families, great strife. Many families came apart. Many farmers tragically committed suicide during the Millennium Drought. And it made a major dent in the overall economy of those communities and throughout the region. And so the face of water scarcity can be extremely excruciating. One of the things that I've been doing over the last few years and working with a lot of my students at the University of Virginia is trying to pull these stories together and bring them into a common database. And so we have been working on trying to identify places around the world where these water shortage impacts are occurring and documenting what happened there. Was it the inability to generate electricity because there wasn't enough water available to cool a coal-fired power plant? Was it because there wasn't enough water to irrigate agricultural crops, and so there were big losses, both of crop production and of revenue generation? Was it ecosystem, ecological impacts? And so trying to pull these impacts together, and my students this semester have added 400 dots onto this map. So it's giving us a very rich picture of what goes wrong when we run out of water, and I think is a real bellwether for the things that we don't want to see happening in other places, or certainly not becoming more intensified in the future. And so through this, we're starting to see a picture emerge of what happens when we run out of water. This is due to the boxes here are not intended to be boxes. This is just an illustration of my ineptitude with PowerPoint and being able to create more of a continuum or a gradient here. The numbers are not hard and fixed. These are really at this point just impressions, qualitative observations, if you will, looking at real data and the evidence base that's available. But let me tell you what this story is intended to say. Very early on in the utilization of the water resources or the depletion of things like rivers and streams, we start to see ecological impacts emerge quite early on in that progression. And so in many places around the world, we see now scientific, tangible, credible evidence that as you start to get sometimes as low as 10% depletion, but certainly by the time you get to 20% removal of the water available within the river on an ongoing basis, you start to see ecological impacts. What does that mean? It means sensitive species beginning to disappear. It means populations of other aquatic species starting to decline. So that process shows up very, very early on, but in many cases, of course, that's hidden beneath the water surface, and so we're not observing this. But again, the evidence is accumulating from places all around the world. As you get further into that progression, you start to see things that people are more directly impacted by and of greater concern to our economies and our societies. And so we start to see impacts on what we have now come to call ecosystem services. We don't have enough water to cool the coal-fired power plants. We don't have enough water to fill the reservoirs to generate hydroelectric power. We don't have enough water flowing into coastal ecosystems and estuaries to be able to sustain fisheries and the livelihoods and well-being that are dependent upon those things. And so that starts to show up when we're getting used to taking about half of the water out of these systems. And as we get further and further on this progression, as you start to show up on that first couple of maps that I showed you, then you start to experience real economic impacts on a recurring basis. In 2011, the state of Texas lost something on the order of $7 billion in agricultural revenues in a single year because of drought and because of the heavy level of water use. China, on average, a World Bank study that came out a few years ago, China on average loses $39 billion of manufacturing and industrial revenue because of the lack of water, of having water shortages. So these issues really mount up in a hurry, and they're a big deal. So in the book, I talk about the ways that we have learned to address or to deal with this imbalance in the water budget between the inputs and the outputs. And so you're all familiar with terms like supply management and demand management. And I'm a lumper, so I put all the different many ways that we try to find more water, create more water, or to save some water into these 6 big categories. The 5 on the top are dealing with the supply side. How can we add more water into our local water budget to offset some of this imbalance? And you also see the cost arrow there. So again, this is as a general rule. It holds true in most places, but it's very context dependent. But the ones on the upper end of the scale here are more costly and therefore posing greater problems for cities that are trying to apply those. And certainly some of these approaches are out of the reach of agricultural irrigation, for example, in terms of the expense of utilizing those. The one area of demand management on the bottom, whether it's water conservation or improved efficiencies or using pricing and markets to try to influence the way that people use water, whatever technique or approach or strategy is used for demand management, that being lumped into this category. And I'm going to spend a good portion of the remainder of my talk focusing on some of those issues, in part for the reason that it's at the bottom of the cost gradient here. So let me show you what this looks like. So because of those impacts that I was just outlining to energy, to manufacturing, to ecosystems, to the availability of safe, clean drinking water in different parts of the world, not surprisingly, communities and governments are going to extraordinary measures to try to balance their water budgets. This is Saudi Arabia. This is a big desalination plant. Of course, I think most of you should be familiar with what desalination is. Basically a technology to remove salt from salty water, whether it's ocean water or saline groundwater aquifers. The Saudis have no perennial rivers in their country, and so they've been entirely dependent upon their groundwater aquifers, and they have seen the levels in their groundwater aquifers declining quite rapidly over the recent decades. And so not surprisingly, the Saudis don't have a whole lot of other options, and so they have invested very, very heavily in desalination. They possess half of the world's capacity for desalination presently, more than 30 large desalting plants. And one of the interesting statistics that I came across was desalination, the reason it's so costly is because it requires so much energy. It requires so much electricity to pull the salt out of ocean water in this case. The Saudis have the benefit, the blessing of having abundant energy supplies, energy reserves, and they're using a good amount of those energy reserves on their desalination plants. In fact, they're using, on average, about 1.5 million barrels of diesel oil to run these desalination plants every single day. So 500 million barrels of oil going into the desalination plants. Unfortunately, that's made the Saudis one of the larger carbon emitters within the Middle East. So there are consequences, obviously, of each of these choices for balancing supply and demand. The Chinese are presently investing in one of the world's largest water importation, water diversion projects. This is called the South-North Water Diversion Project. It literally takes water out of the southern part of the country, specifically the Yangtze River, and runs water, pumps canals, pipes the water into the northern area of China, which is the capital city of Beijing. It is the North China Plain, where the North China Plain aquifer, which is incredibly important to food production in China, has been heavily depleted. The rivers have been dried up in that part of the country. And so they're moving water from the wetter part of the country to the northern part of the country. The New York Times, when writing about this project, referred to it as being equivalent to taking water out of the Missouri River to supply the water for Washington, D.C., New York, and Boston. It moves the water over 1,000 miles. Presently, the price tag has been about $80 billion and increasing every day. Another big water diversion project being proposed in China, it's only on the drawing boards, it's very controversial for obvious reasons. This is a project that would take water out of the Bohai Sea in the eastern coastline of China and literally run the water all the way across the country, so into the Tarim River Basin, where mining and irrigated agriculture has been very, very important, but water supplies are very scarce. And so this is a way of addressing some of that challenge. So it would run basically from about 3,000 miles. So of course that's running water from Virginia to San Diego, if you will. But some of the real challenges with this proposal are the fact that they're taking water out of the ocean, so they've got to desalinate it first, and then they're running it from sea level up to about a mile high in elevation. And so the electricity demands on this project are going to be quite extraordinary and very, very costly, both to build the project as well as to operate it and maintain it over time. In India, there's a similar ambitious, hugely ambitious plan called the River Linking Project, where the proposal is to link the 37 major rivers within the country. This project, if built, again, very controversial, very much only in the planning stages for the most part, but it would move water out of the rivers that still have water in them to supply the rivers that have now been dried up from overuse. And so moving water around on a national scale, on a very grand scale here. And lastly, just to make sure or to remind you that these aren't plans or schemes or grand scale projects that are only being talked about outside the United States. This is a project, these lines here represent a project that was called NWAPA. It was originally developed by a large engineering firm in California called the Parsons Engineering Company. NWAPA stands for the North America Water and Power Alliance. This project would have taken water out of the Yukon and other areas of northern Canada and brought it into the southwestern United States, also connecting with some of the inner coastal waterways to provide navigation traffic throughout the eastern United States. The proponents of this project said that they would be able to double the available water supply in the western United States. A lot of us that went to engineering schools in the 1970s, the 1980s, we heard about NWAPA. A lot of us, I think, thought that the project was sort of lost on the bookshelves had sort of faded into memory. But it's very interesting to see that NWAPA seems to be gaining a little bit of attention again. Who knows whether anything like this or any part of something like this would ever get built, but I just wanted to say that these are the kinds of conversations that are taking place in trying to address the very, very severe problems that I outlined previously. I want to shift now to talking about some of the opportunities and offer a couple of stories of some places where people are really making some progress in addressing their water challenges. And I'm going to start with this statistic. So irrigated agriculture, when you add up the way that water is being used across all of these water-scarce basins that showed up on those first couple of maps that I showed you, when you add up and look at the different areas of use, the different sectors of water use, irrigated agriculture, not surprisingly, comes out on top and in fact is very, very dominant if you're looking at the consumptive use of water. Again, for those of you that might be confused about some of these numbers, for instance, here in the United States, you hear that power generation, electricity generation, is the #1 use of water in the United States. And in fact, that's true. I think it's about 49% of all the water that's withdrawn from rivers, lakes, and aquifers in the United States goes to generating electricity. But if you look at it from the standpoint of water that's used and not returned to the same water basin, the numbers start to look very, very different. Okay? And so power generation in the United States then drops down to being less than 10%. fact, less than 5% of the consumptive use of water. Understanding both sides of those numbers is very, very important, because to understand why rivers are going dry and why aquifers are being depleted, you really have to understand the consumptive use side, okay? Not news to many of you in the audience, but just wanted to make sure we were clear about the statistics that I'm using here. So if you look at consumptive use and you look at the places that are experiencing water shortages and scarcity around the world, more than 90% of that consumptive use is going to irrigated agriculture. I want to be very, very clear about the fact that I am not using this statistic in any way to vilify or to point fingers at irrigated agriculture. We all depend upon irrigated agriculture. It's providing 40% of the food on the planet presently. There's no question that we absolutely have to use water in irrigated agriculture, and we want to continue to use it. But in my opinion, these numbers suggest the places that we should be looking for some opportunities to be able to rebalance some of those imbalanced water budgets in different places. And I also want to make the point that I'm going to illustrate with a couple of stories here that I think this creates huge opportunities for farmers. That there are opportunities here, there is some flexibility here, there are some possibilities of using water in a different way, of being able to save some water in irrigated agriculture, and creating the opportunity to do the kinds of transformations and shifts that most farmers have been wanting to do, I think, for a long time, and are quite willing to do. And this might present some real opportunity. This situation might present some real opportunity, particularly in places that are running short of water. So let me illustrate that with a story from the other coast, from San Diego. I grew up in San Diego, and so I was very aware of the fact that San Diego has been chasing water literally almost since the time that European settlers arrived in that part of the world. San Diego really got into trouble during World War II, and we had a huge influx of Navy personnel going to the training center in San Diego. It's right in the bend of San Diego Bay. There is the Naval Training Center. With that infusion of so many new Navy personnel coming into the city, it really stressed San Diego's water supply. They had to pass an emergency act of Congress to build a canal to import water from the Colorado River Basin at that time. And so that began the process of San Diego becoming very, very dependent on somebody else's water, on reaching into other places, other water basins, to be able to import water into the city. They also have benefited for decades from bringing water in from the northern part of California down into Southern California at the same time. Eventually, San Diego started to look at their options, and they were in fact running out of options. They were looking at things like the expensive desalination plants. And by the way, San Diego County Water Authority is now building the largest desalination plant in all of North America in the city of Carlsbad, California. But at the same time, about in the early 2000s, San Diego started to look to the east and started to look at this area that's called the Imperial Irrigation District. It's over on the California-Arizona border, right on the Colorado River. The Imperial Irrigation District is the largest water user on the entire Colorado River system. It uses about 20% of all the water in the Colorado River Basin. They also hold the oldest, most senior, highest priority water right in that entire basin. And so it's an obvious place to take a look. San Diego took a look and started to talk to the farmers over in the Imperial Irrigation District and struck a deal with the farmers over there. And I think the construction of the deal was very interesting from the standpoint that the city was smart enough not to be prescriptive with these farmers. It didn't tell the farmers what they thought were the ways that the farmers could save some water. San Diego was simply interested in the water. We don't care how you get it. And if you are able to save some water out on the farm, we will pay you handsomely for it. So the deal is about $300 million over a 10 or 15-year time period to bring water out of the Imperial Irrigation District. Those farmers have been very innovative, very creative, and taking advantage of the opportunity here to have a new revenue stream coming into the irrigation district, creating some options for them, providing some capital for them to be able to make improvements in their irrigation systems or in their crop production that they'd been wanting to make for a long time. And so they have really seized this opportunity that their water has great value to other water users, and being able to construct a deal that worked for them as well as worked for the city. And so everything from lining very, very leaky irrigation ditches like this, going to very modernized technology and measurement systems, doing very advanced work on the irrigation practices on the farms, and also shifting to different crops in some cases that are less water intensive but still generating the same level or greater economic revenues for the farmers. In some cases going to rotational fallowing so that they're sharing. Some of these farmers are agreeing not to produce a crop in a given year in exchange for being compensated financially, and in fact making more during those years than they could from the original crop production. And so, as I say, it really has created some opportunities for the farmers, and it also has provided urgently needed water supply for the city of San Diego. This has been very important for San Diego's water supply system because it is the most cost-effective means of balancing their water equation that's available to them. So again, back to my earlier slide and talking about the different costs per unit of water associated with things like desalination, water importation, building new reservoirs, that sort of thing. Water conservation almost always comes out on the bottom of that cost-effectiveness scale. And when I say conservation, I mean both within the urban environment as well as out in the agricultural fields. And very, very highly cost-effective for the city of San Diego, and so this was a very attractive aspect of their wanting to look over to the Imperial Irrigation District into arrange a deal. It also has provided the city with the opportunity to diversify their water portfolio. So you see here on the left in 1991, when I was still living in San Diego, there was the vast majority, more than 96% of their water supply being imported from the Colorado River and from Northern California. Over time now becoming quite a bit more diversified. The green bar in here represents the water that's coming in from the Imperial Irrigation District, and so already it's more than a quarter of the available water supply in the city of San Diego. When you look out to 2020, at that point, more than a third, 37% of San Diego's water coming out of this deal with Imperial Irrigation District. The red there, the 14% urban conservation. So in total, conservation alone representing half of San Diego's strategy for rebalancing its water budget and providing a much greater sense of security and sustainability going forward. And by the way, I will also say that although I've been emphasizing the cost effectiveness here, if you look at it from the standpoint of environmental impacts and potential environmental damage associated with these other water supply alternatives, investing in water conservation makes a great deal because, of course, it is either not causing additional environmental impacts in most cases or even be able to lessen some of those impacts that already exist. So I just want to suggest that there are opportunities for thinking in this way in many different river basins around the world, including places that a lot of you are working in, such as the Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, and Flint. When you look at the Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, and Flint, as Donald will speak to you later in the day, Donald is farmer from Georgia, this is a basin that only has problems with water shortages a small percentage of the time. I think last night over dinner, Donald mentioned that it was about 13% of the time that they even have water shortage problems. But in order to resolve that issue, I think it is very instructive to look at the way that water is being used in the overall water basin and to ask the question, as many of the people in that basin and in the ACF stakeholders group are asking, are there some ways to think about exchanges and sharing of the responsibility for water savings? If we're going to have to reduce our water consumption during certain times, during that 13% of the time when we have water shortages, we should be looking at everything. We should be looking at the industrial use, the electricity generation, the domestic use in the basin, as well as looking at irrigated agriculture and seeing whether or not there aren't some opportunities for collaboration, for some deal making, for some negotiations to try to resolve the problems that all of them are having. When you have a water shortage problem, it is a problem for everybody. And I and many of the rest of you have grown very tired of hearing the polarization of cities pointing at the farmers and saying the farmers are using the water wastefully. Most of our water is going out there on the farms. That's the place that you need to, that you need to address this problem, and the farmers pointing the fingers at the cities and saying, look at the wasteful use of water, look at those green lawns, those fountains, those swimming pools. This is not a constructive discussion. And I think that there are such tremendous opportunities if we can start talking with each other and start exploring the opportunities for sharing water and compensating each other for trades of the availability of water and the rights to use water. I think there's tremendous opportunity and potential in resolving these issues around the world. And in fact, there is some terrific work already going on within the Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, and Flint River Basin. We know how to conserve water, how to become more efficient. This is a point that I make in every place I go and every talk I give, is that we don't need a technological breakthrough necessarily to resolve these problems. We already have the tools, the technologies, the proven practices, the documented evidence that tells us how to better manage water. It's just that we're not applying it as broadly as we should or as intensely as we should be. And so my great hope for places like the Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, and Flint is that we can find a way to meet those water needs for everybody and to be able to maintain the natural environment. Beautiful places like the Flint River in a healthy, ecologically vibrant condition, not just for us, but for our future generations of our children that will follow us. I'm going to close with a couple of principles that I highlighted in my book. What I referred to as sustainability principles in the book, I had 7 of them. I'm not going to go through all 7 of those right now, but just to illustrate them in cartoon form, these are some things that I have seen in my decades of work in different places around the world. These are things which aren't absolutely essential to get yourself out of water scarcity or prevent it in the future, but they sure do help a great deal. And so if we think here figuratively as the glass being full is the renewable water supply, the water that's available to any local community or area of water use. And the first principle here that I will say, and by the way, each of these principles, or at least the first 3 that I'll mention, are very much in play in different places like the Central Coastal Plain aquifers and the management plans that have been put into place there. So just again, I wanted to give recognition and acknowledgement of some of the progress that's being made there. So first, you have to set a limit on how much water we can take. Now, that can be a highly variable limit from year to year, from wet versus dry, but we need to be setting, ultimately, limits. If you leave the common pool resource of water available, people will take it, and the use will continue to grow, and that's the tragedy that we've seen in so many places and was so well illustrated by those couple of graphs that I showed you earlier for the Colorado River Basin and for the Murray-Darling Basin, where the water use just progressively goes up and up and up to the point where we end up in calamity. So setting that sustainable limit, figuring out where that limit is, we have the data, the models, the tools to be able to do that well. There's no reason for us not to do it. Based on the reliable water availability, and by that I mean the fact that recognizing that it does fluctuate from year to year and from decade to decade. Accounting for the ecological needs. The ecological science has, the science of environmental flow assessment has advanced greatly in the last couple of decades, and the scientific community can help advise us now on how much water we need to leave within the river to maintain ecological health, to keep the fish in a good condition, to be able to allow enough water to pass into the coastal areas so that we're maintaining healthy fisheries and productive economies in those coastal areas. So the ecological needs need to be accounted for, and in fact, that's why I'm showing the glass not being drawn down to a lower and lower level here. And also, we need to be thinking about, we've got a shifting climate. There are pronounced climate trends, and many showing up in the data records already for the last couple of decades in many places in the world. And we need to be attentive, respectful of that, and planning accordingly for that. So hedging our bets into the future is a big part of setting the appropriate limits on how much water can be extracted. For those places that were on my earlier maps, 1/3 of all the water basins, the rivers, lakes, and aquifers around the world, they're already arguably over the line. By virtually any measure of sustainability, use of the water resources, they're using too much. They're consumptively using too much. They're bumping up against water shortages on a recurring basis. They don't want that to happen anymore. And in order to prevent that from happening in the future, they're going to actually have to draw back. Again, I'll use the analog here of the Central Coastal Plain aquifers. There is a plan, Part of that plan expresses the need to reduce the pumping from certain of those aquifers over time in order to get out of the situation of having a progressively declining aquifer levels. And finding other ways to rebalance those water equations without having to drive those water levels down further and further to the point where it becomes too expensive to extract the water, or we incur other problems like saltwater intrusion. Once we've defined what those long-term sustainable limits are on the available water supply, then we need to get clear on who gets to use the water, how much of the water, during what times of the year. I want to recognize that there's a lot of pushback on the issue of water rights within many parts of the eastern United States presently. I haven't seen any place in the world where they have been successful in managing water use against scarcity when they haven't gotten clear on water rights and haven't gotten clear and specific and quantified on how much water different water users or different sectors get to use. I do think this is a very, very important part of the overall sustainability equation for these places that are bumping up against the limits of water supply. This last one is going to strike many of you as being controversial. Many of you will have a visceral reaction to it. This tends to be, in too many places, characterized as being privatization or commodification of the water resources. But what we have seen in many places that have made it possible to exchange rights to use water is that it has become a very powerful tool in managing their way out of scarcity, out of conflict, and out of competition. In fact, this practice of trading the rights to use water has been in place and used in different parts of the world for literally thousands of years. Many places in the world, this began as bartering, an agreement between farmers among villages for who had access or rights to use the local water source. These kinds of agreements have been in place for much of the time that humans have been utilizing water resources. It can have some real advantages if properly governed, if properly managed, and with proper attention given to unintended consequences, like managing the price of water so that everybody can continue to afford the water, making sure that enough water is always left within the natural ecosystems, and that the natural ecosystems don't get priced out or excluded out of this kind of a system. It provides the opportunity for those that are most desperately needing the water and placing the highest value on the water to be able to access water, either temporarily or on a more regular basis. I think very interestingly, from the standpoint of organizations like mine, the Nature Conservancy, it creates the opportunity to repair rivers, lakes, wetlands where they have lost much of their available water supply. If we have the availability to acquire rights to use water from other users who are willing to make some of their water available, who are willing to invest in water-saving measures, perhaps with compensation from an organization like mine, we can start to put water back into freshwater ecosystems through that mechanism. And very interestingly, this process greatly incentivizes, greatly stimulates water-saving measures, investments in water conservation and efficiency, because if a water user can gain a financial return, a financial reward, if you will, for finding ways to use less water and making that water then available either for the natural ecosystems, putting water back into the stream, or making water available for other users, such as in the case of the Imperial Irrigation District in the city of San Diego, then what we're seeing in different parts of the world that are practicing this kind of water trading is a huge acceleration of investments in water efficiency, water conservation measures, changes in practices to try to save water. So I'm going to close there. I hope that some of what I've had to say has been of interest. Hopefully some of these stories shed some light on some of the possibilities. I remain eternally optimistic, and with the help of all of you, stewards of our future, I think that the future is going to be bright, and we're all going to be in a much better place in the coming decades. So thank you all for your terrific work.
Thank you, Brian, for that excellent keynote address. Brian has agreed to take some questions, If you have questions, if you would raise your hand, one of our event staff will bring a microphone to you. If you have questions. I see one down here and one here. You may go ahead.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Driving up here from Jacksonville, I was listening to NPR, and they were running a program on a Saudi Arabian farm that bought 23 square miles of land or some such thing in Arizona to raise hay to ship back to Saudi Arabia for feeding cattle.
Yes.
Do you have any comments on that? Now, they did interview local farmers who saw no problem with that, but it brings to mind the entire situation of crops being raised and then that water in those crops being exported. Sacramento Valley water comes into mind with that as well.
Yeah, terrific question. Hopefully everybody heard it clearly with the microphone. So although a number of really interesting schemes have been proposed for literally moving water physically around the world, the cost of that is still quite prohibitive, and so we haven't seen much in the way of large tanker ships loading up with water from the Great Lakes and taking it to supply other parts of the world. Even the costs, as I've emphasized, these long-distance pipelines have been prohibitive, in part because water is very heavy, and the price of water as compared to oil is relatively inexpensive, and so we're not seeing global transport of water supplies, of water resources on any kind of a meaningful scale. But what we are saying to the question that was just posed is we are seeing the transport of what's been labeled as virtual water or embedded water. So what that means is that back in about 2000, a professor at King's College in London came up with this idea of virtual water, the fact that it takes a certain volume of water to produce anything that we depend upon, that we consume. And one of Tony Allen's graduate students, a fellow by the name of Arjen Hoekstra, started to put numbers on that, which became known as water footprints. And so we now know things like in California it takes a gallon of water to produce a single almond. And we know numbers for all of these things. We know how much water it takes to produce an Intel computer chip. And so there's been a whole cottage industry of calculating water footprints, and in part because people are very interested not just in how much water it takes to produce the thing, but it starts to create this image then if those goods are being traded, particularly on the global market, how much water from a given place is being transported virtually when you move irrigated hay or alfalfa from Arizona to the country of Saudi Arabia. And by the way, something on the order of about a third of the hay and alfalfa out of California gets transported to China feedlots presently. And it's also a very large portion of California's overall water use. We had an interesting conversation about this over the dinner table last night. The farmers are perfectly happy with that in Arizona because they are being paid fairly and being paid more than fairly, I would say. That they see that they've got a new buyer, and it's a buyer who can afford to pay more than there are other buyers that were more locally available to them. So the farmers are trying to make a living from producing their crop. They're trying to make a revenue, and so this makes a lot of sense to the farmers in Arizona and California. So one part of this, of course, is just the global economics of supply and demand, of crop commodity prices, and whether or not you can transport these things over long distances and still make an attractive profit from it. It also has a lot to do with consumer demands, of course. And so one of the things that's been very interesting to watch on this global scale is as diets are changing in different parts of the world, as consumption patterns are changing in different parts of the world, how it's affecting these global trades in virtual water. So I'll give you one example. China, the average Chinese person's water footprint has tripled in the last 15 years entirely because of the shift in their diet from going toward more and more of a meat-based diet. And because of the water shortages in much of China and the difficulty of moving water across the country into the North China Plain, where much of their agricultural production takes place, The Chinese are looking for other alternatives, like importing hay and alfalfa out of the Central Valley of California. Another thing that I thought you were going to mention is this, this issue of water grabbing or land grabbing. So some governments are now purchasing or leasing lands, agriculturally suitable lands in other countries to be able to grow their agricultural crops that they need to import. So in some cases, it's not paying Arizona farmers to grow it, but buying Arizona land and producing it using Middle Eastern farmers or Chinese farmers that are literally being brought in to grow some of that produce. I have some of my own personal feelings about whether that's right or wrong, but I think ultimately the place that I always go back to is the water resource being managed sustainably in those local environments? Is the water that's being used to grow the hay and alfalfa in Arizona being managed in a sustainable manner? Is the water used to grow those things creating problems for other people who are dependent upon that water? And I think governments now should start to ask the questions as was posed during our dinner conversation last night. Is this the highest and best use for the water? Should we just let the global economics be the dictator of how water gets used, or should we be a little bit more thoughtful about how we want to use available water supplies in the Flint River, in the Colorado River, in the Gila River of Arizona? I don't see government stepping into that fray in the near future, but I think it's something that's certainly as a society we should be thinking about more. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer. I'm going to eat up all the question and answer time if I keep that up.
Yeah, thanks. I enjoyed your talk. I'm right here. Oh. And I want to say I'm familiar with your name because of work I did with the North Carolina Ecological Flows Science Advisory Board.
Yes.
And so what this board did was they looked at scientific methods to try and find a way to flag when water withdrawals in North Carolina's future would trigger a flow that affects the ecology, correct?
Right.
So I was just curious about your thoughts on that work that they've done, and if you have a suggestion for moving forward in North Carolina with ecological flows planning.
Yeah, thanks for the question, because the way that I do my talks now, I spent a couple decades of my career working on the environmental science, trying to answer the question of how much water does a river need, and participating in a lot of those exercises. And so the evolution of that science over the last couple of decades went from very intensive studies of individual rivers and streams and trying to answer that question in all of its fullness. How much water do these particular plants or this riparian or floodplain forest need? How much do these freshwater mussels need? How much does this fish species need, et cetera, et cetera? That is still the best way to answer that question, but it's very time and cost prohibitive, or at least challenging. And so as we grew frustrated with not seeing the investment of doing this for every single river and stream in every state, in every country around the world, we then came up with other ways to try to cover this. So the next step that we took was, well, maybe if we look at a region or a state and we recognize that certain rivers and streams have similarities to each other, we can classify them, put them into different types, maybe we can come up with environmental flow prescriptions for certain types of rivers. Like this type of river, you better keep at least X% of the base flow there. It probably needs an occasional flood of this size, you know, that sort of thing. Thinking that if we regionalized, we could economize and we could expedite the process. And I still think very, very highly of that approach. But again, very, very few states are applying that approach, even though it is more cost-effective and more expedient than doing river by river. And so a couple of years ago, I stepped out on a very thin limb and said, well, how are we going to backstop this? For all the places that are not going to get that kind of scientific study, what should the presumption be? What is the precaution? If you apply the precautionary principle and you say We don't want to do ecological harm here, and we want to be proactive about that in places like North Carolina or some of the wetter places in the world where maybe we haven't exhausted the available water supplies. What would that look like? And so the method that you're referring to, or the work that I think you're referring to, is what I called a presumptive standard. And that presumptive standard was very much based on my sense and my observations of the evidence from around the world that I mentioned in one of my earlier slides, that if you stay within about 20% of the original historic, what some would call the natural flow conditions, you probably are in pretty safe ground ecologically. You probably aren't going to be having substantial, irreversible ecological impacts. And recognizing that if you go beyond that, then you're increasing your ecological risk. And so it's been interesting to see how this plays out in the policy arena. I think that in all cases, I think the presumptive standard sends a warning sign and says, just be aware that as you go beyond that 20%, you are entering into a zone of increasing ecological risk, and it will have ecological environmental consequences. At the same time, do everything you can to catch up and make the necessary investments so that you do the more site-specific, detailed, more comprehensive science so that you can really hone in on what the real numbers probably should be. I think that we need to put some form of protection and recognition for the ecological role of leaving water in streams in place everywhere. As to exactly how you do that and how you make the compromises or trades with the existing water uses, I just think it's fascinating to see how that's going to play out in a lot of different places. There's obviously, in a place where you're already beyond the presumptive standard, then obviously you are likely going to be making some consideration and compensation for that. So one of the things that I've seen in places, a number of states in the United States, but really first and probably best developed in South Africa, where they went to a scale of protection that was literally, you could think of it as an A, B, C, D, where certain rivers were already being heavily utilized, they were really important for economic production, or maybe they were just really important for basic human needs and uses. That was going to take a certain percentage of the available renewable water supply. Let's recognize that. Society places value on that. Let's recognize that that's not going to be an A-grade stream from an ecological standpoint. And so going to a different gradational system has worked for some countries in some geopolitical settings. There is no right and wrong. You have to work this out in the policy arena. You have to work this out with the community of water users. But I think it is important. What we've tried to do is to simply bring recognition and awareness to the fact that water left alone in the freshwater ecosystems has value, and it's actually doing something that's of value actually to our societies. Thanks for the question.
One more question over there.
God, I still haven't made it out of a question and answer session without getting that question. Was that close? Wayne, you should have picked somebody else. Obviously, I'm making fun of it because it is highly controversial, but it is a big issue in many parts of our country. Just a couple of observations on it. And I was corrected on this out in Utah last week. Not all types of fracking require huge volumes of water. There are different forms of fracking, and so I was put in my place on that last week, and now I understand that better. But many of the fracking wells do require the use of a lot of water. If you put that volume of water into a broader context of how does the cumulative or aggregate use of water for fracking compare to other uses of water, electricity generation, agricultural production, domestic, other industrial uses of water, in most places it turns out to be a very, very small fraction of the overall water use. Although there are different contexts, like certain counties in southeastern Texas where it's half of the total water consumption in certain counties in Texas. So it's very site dependent. And really, you know, in many, many cases, this isn't about the quantity of the water, it's about the quality of the water, and it's about the risk to the quality of the water. When fracking is done well and done according to the book, and the wells are constructed properly and carefully regulated, the risks of water contamination can be very, very small. But things do happen in a number of places, and so that's of great concern. I think at the end of the day, again, I would go back to looking both from the quantity and the quality side and asking, you know, have due considerations being taken? Does everybody really understand how much water we're talking about? Does everybody understand what are the water contamination or pollution risks associated with different activities? I think that these issues can be well managed, but unfortunately in most places in the world, and that includes most of the United States, the degree of monitoring and regulation and planning, thoughtful planning, foresightful planning, simply isn't in existence yet. And so I think that, so I'm going to weasel out of your question and say that I think that, you know, the answers or the resolution to this are really the investment in the governance capacity and the investment of the necessary resources to manage water much better than we are presently.
Thank you again, Brian. Thank you.